It started with a warning, then silence. A single account pulled down 12,000 files from SharePoint in under 20 minutes. No malware, no DLP alert, no blocked session. The zero trust controls all said aloud. Here's the problem. Zero trust without audit evidence is policy theater. Verification isn't a checkbox. It's a trail. Today, we'll trace 4 log sources that turn suspicion into proof and prevention. We'll pull Entra sign-in risk, the unified audit log, PURVIEW policy edits, and Copilot interactions into one timeline. There's one log pivot that exposes data staging every time. We'll get to it. First, verify the verifier. Entra ID sign-in and risk, verify the verifier. Every breach begins with an identity. The controls look solid. Conditional access, MFA, compliant devices. But the evidence tells a different story. Risky sign-ins are the earliest artifact that something is off, and ignoring them quietly voids verify explicitly. Here's what most teams miss. The Entra identity stack splits your visibility. Risky sign-ins are a rolling 30-day window. Risk detections, like anomalous token or attacker in the middle, persist for 90 days. That asymmetry matters. The timelines revealed that when analysts only check risky sign-ins, they lose the earliest signals after a month and can't reconstruct the path. Okay, so basically, track 3 streams relentlessly: risky sign-ins, risk detections, and workload identity anomalies. Risky sign-ins show the attempt. Risk detections show the pattern. Workload identity anomalies surface service principles and managed identities behaving like users. Because attackers love app permissions that never get MFA prompts. High-value detections deserve priority triage. Anomalous token means a token is being replayed outside its expected envelope. Classic session theft. Attacker in the middle indicates the sign-in route brushed a malicious proxy. Unfamiliar sign-in properties ties together odd combinations. New device, odd IP, unexpected client. The simple version is these 3 together raise the probability of credential misuse fast. Here's the weird part. Conditional access often succeeds while the threat remains. A medium-risk sign-in prompts for MFA, the user passes, and the session proceeds. Policy says verified. The evidence suggests otherwise. Repeated medium-risk events over days correlate strongly with later data staging. Therefore, escalate repetition, not just severity. To make this actionable, join what the user did with why it was allowed. Combine Entra sign-in logs with conditional access evaluation. The goal: for each successful authentication, record the policy path, blocked, MFA required, session controls applied, and tie it to the risk context. When a user gets through on require MFA 3 times from unfamiliar properties in a week, that's an investigation, not business as usual. Think of it like a bouncer with a checklist versus a detective with a case file. The bouncer sees an ID and lets them in. The detective builds a narrative across nights, noticing the same face with different stories. Your logs must act like the detective. Specifics that hold up in forensics: user ID, app ID, IP, device ID, and session ID equivalents. If session ID is missing, derive a session key from user ID plus app ID plus a 30-minute window. Risk detail and risk level at the event time. Don't infer later. Conditional access policy outcome. Capture which policy tipped the decision. Upon closer examination, repeated medium risk with changing IP ranges is more predictive than a single high-risk spike. The counterintuitive part is that automated blocks on high risk are common. The slow drip of medium becomes the real lead. Escalate by count and diversity. 3 medium risk sign-ins from 3 ASNs in 7 days triggers a case. Micro story from a typical tenant. An account with no travel history shows medium risk sign-ins at 0214, 0352, and 0510 UTC, each require MFA, all passed. The next morning, SharePoint shows a new sync client registration. No alert fired. The evidence chain started here. Identity friction, then foothold. How to make it stick operationally. Alert when risky sign-ins count N per user in 7 days with distinct client IP ranges. Alert when a workload identity suddenly authenticates from public IP space or gains API permissions it never used. Quarantine logic. If risk, Chishi high and token anomaly present, force sign out and require password reset. If repeated medium risk aligns with new device registration, flag for human review. Retention realities demand discipline. Export risky sign-ins weekly to preserve beyond 30 days and store risk detections for at least 180 days in your CM. The lesson is simple. If you can't replay the first 12 hours, you can't prove intent or sequence. Here's what most people miss. Identities authenticate first. Lateral movement starts after the door opens. The sign-in narrative is the prologue, not the story. With the verifier verified, the next step is to trace movement. The unified ledger will show where the access went, how privileges shifted, and when the data began to pool. The unified audit log trace lateral movement across workloads. The door opened. Now the movement begins. The unified audit log is the ledger, one place where Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, and admin actions write their traces. In this environment, nothing is accidental. Every escalation, every permission tweak, every quiet mailbox peak leaves residue here. If Entra told us who got in and why, the UAL tells us where they went and what changed. Why this matters is simple. Lateral movement in M365 is cross-service by design. Attackers don't stay in one workload. They pivot. They add a forwarding rule. They grant a SharePoint group edit rights. They enable a new sync client, and they generate sharing links that bypass normal access paths. If you only watch one pane, you miss the sequence. The UAL stitches it. Here's what most people miss. Critical events cluster before exfiltration. Privilege changes, mailbox access by non-owners, and SharePoint site permission edits in a narrow window are the tell. A mail forwarding rule to an external domain isn't just a mail event. It's an early warning that someone wants data to leave the tenant reliably. Pair that with a sudden burst of SharePoint file downloaded and file accessed events, and you have staging. Okay, so basically you need 3 lenses: identity, privilege, and data movement. The identity lens keeps user id, app id, and client IP consistent. The privilege lens watches for add mailbox permission, set mailbox, add unified group links, and role assignments. The data lens tracks file downloaded, file sync added, sharing link created, and access requests. The simple version is, when privilege and data lenses spike together, that's not collaboration, it's preparation. The evidence suggests data staging has distinct signals. Mass downloads rarely look like a single endpoint pulling one folder. They arrive as parallel fetches from SharePoint and OneDrive, plus the quiet enabling of sync on a new device. Unusual creation of anonymous or company-wide sharing links appears when direct access would be noisy. And in Exchange, rules that auto-forward, redirect, or BCC outbound mail surface just before the cutover to trace the artifact's session IDs. UAL doesn't hand you a session ID, so build one. User ID plus client IP plus app ID within a 30-45 minute window is a workable surrogate. Join adjacent events to build a path. Permission change. Access burst. Sharing link creation. External forwarding. Deduplicate repetitive low-value noise, like repeated heartbeat actions, and keep the high entropy changes. Here's the counterintuitive part. Mass download by count alone is a weak detector. People sync libraries. Instead, detect deltas. A user who normally reads 20 files per day suddenly touches 800 unique items across 2 sites in 30 minutes, and within that same window, a new sync relationship is established. In other words, change from baseline plus new capability is the indicator, not raw volume. Kill chain reconstruction in the UAL works like this. Correlate set inbox rule or new inbox rule that forwards to an external domain with SharePoint file downloaded spikes within the same user session window. If you also see sharing link created with scope anyone or organization for sensitive libraries, you have both a primary and a fallback exfil route. Add admin operations, add role group member or site collection admin changes, and you can date the escalation that enabled it. Licensing and retention influence what you can prove. E3 gives you the core, with many premium events now available, but PURVIEW Audit Premium adds high-value events and longer look-back. 10-year retention exists, but only if you configure it and export or archive properly. Gaps happen, ingestion delays, throttling, API backoffs. Build an export strategy. Stream UAL via the Management Activity API to a workspace you control, then normalize fields so joins are consistent later. Practical mechanics matter. The Management Activity API delivers content blobs by record type, Exchange, SharePoint, Azure AD, DLP. Normalize timestamps to UTC and index by user ID, client IP, source file name, object ID, and operation. For KQL and Sentinel, shape events into sessions and compute per session unique file count, unique site count, and privilege change flags. Dedupe noisy operations by hashing on operation plus object ID plus 5-minute bucket. A microstory from a routine investigation, no malware alerts, but the UAL showed set mailbox to enable forwarding to customer mailbox Outlook. Comment 0912. At 0918, sharing link created for a finance library with scope organization. At 0923, file sync added on a device never seen before. From 0924 to 0936, 1,100 unique file downloaded events across finance and HR sites. No DLP triggers. The ledger told the story end to end. Alert logic should reflect chain patterns, not single events. If new inbox rule or set mailbox forwarding to an external domain occurs, and within 60 minutes the same user ID shows SharePoint file downloaded rate above 95th percentile, raise high severity. If sharing link created scope widens on a sensitive site and a new sync relationship appears within 30 minutes, escalate to investigation even without high file counts. If adspoozer or role assignments expand site admin rights followed by access surges, trigger immediate review. For defensibility and scale, build suppression windows so you don't page on legitimate migrations. Take sanctioned jobs by service principal id or by an allow list of admin actors, and require change tickets to carry a correlation tag in the audit's additional details field. If absent, treat spikes as suspicious. Retention and licensing aside, the key is correlation. The UAL is the cross-workload ledger. Use it to prove the path. When evidence is coherent, privileges expanded, access spiked, egress channels primed, you can move from suspicion to fact. And when the ledger goes quiet right before a spike, that silence is evidence too. Often someone dimmed the lights. That's where PURVIEW policy tampering becomes the next pivot. PURVIEW retention and policy tampering. When the lights go out, the ledger shows movement, then the trace thins. When exfiltration is imminent, attackers don't just move fast, they dim the room. PURVIEW is where they reach for the switch. Retention policies, label publishing, and audit configuration edits are the quiet controls that decide whether evidence survives long enough to matter. If Entra proves entry and the URL shows motion, PURVIEW changes explain why the record suddenly goes vague. Why this matters is simple. Disabling or weakening retention is the classic cover your tracks move. Zero trust assumes breach, but defensibility assumes immutable evidence. When retention shifts to retain none, when label policies stop applying to the sensitive sites under pressure, or when audit settings toggle, the storyline breaks. In a forensic case, broken timelines aren't a nuisance, they're the point. What to track is precise. 3 families of edits are high value. Retention policy changes, creation, scope edits, mode switches, retain, none, deletion. Audit configuration changes, starting or stopping audit recording, audit log retention window changes, export connector adjustments. Label and policy publishing, sensitivity label modifications, auto-labeling rules, changes to which SharePoint sites or Exchange locations are in scope. Okay, so basically treat every policy edit as a potential precursor or accomplice to data movement. The evidence suggests that edits cluster before or within hours of access spikes. The simple version is Privilege expands, data flows, then someone trims retention to erase the trail. To trace the artifacts, align 3 timestamps in one view. Who changed what policy? Actor, object. The exact scope after change included locations, excluded sites, mode, and the adjacent UAL burst from the same department, site, or owner. Upon closer examination, alignment beats coincidence. When a finance retention policy loses the HR site 2 hours before that site records a mass download, it's not hygiene, it's staging. Alert patterns should be narrow and loud. Any retention policy set to do not retain on locations previously covered. Raise high severity immediately. Disabling purview audit recording or reducing audit retention within 7 days of privilege escalations. Escalate to incident. Sensitivity label policy narrowing scope on sensitive sites within 24 hours of sharing link created spikes. Investigate. The counterintuitive part, policy tampering, often arrives via legitimate channels. A global admin toggles settings. The change looks like maintenance. Therefore, require dual control on retention edits and log the request identifier inside additional details. No change ticket ID, no change. In this environment, nothing is accidental. Operationally, build a policy change ledger with join keys. You can prove later, normalize actor, UPN, correlation ID, and client IP. Capture before and after snapshots of policy, JSON. Don't store diffs only. Stamp a change. Intent field, maintenance, migration, incident, emergency, with a mandatory value. A micro story from a routine case. At 11:04, an admin reduced audit retention from 180 to 30 days. At 11:18, a sensitivity label lost auto-apply on 3 high-value sites. By 12:02, file sync added and file downloaded surged across those sites. No DLP alarms, no errors, just less light. The policy edits weren't noise, they were the setup. Compliance posture depends on immutable logs. Purview Audit, Premium, helps with richer events and longer retention, but only if configured. Export policy change events to a controlled store with write-once semantics and mirror them to a secondary region for resilience. Assign accountable owners. One team can propose, a second approves, a third observes. The lesson is clinical. If the light switch is in reach of the suspect, your evidence is negotiable. Still, when the room dims, one surface can glow brighter than expected. Copilot's interactions. If data aggregation happens by AI, the footprints are different. Summaries, source references, and cross-site touches. If those are logged, they'll outline what text made it into the prompt and which files fed the answer. If they aren't, we name the gap and compensate elsewhere. Copilot interaction logs, AI as an exfil multiplier. When the room dims, Copilot can still see. That's why it matters. Copilot aggregates across SharePoint and OneDrive at conversational speed, summarizing, comparing, and extracting patterns humans would need hours to compile. If it touches a file to answer a prompt, that's access. If that access isn't logged, your zero-trust narrative fractures. Post-August 2024, the audit surface improved. Copilot interaction events now reference which service hosted the content when the model fetched it, and pointers to the underlying files used to construct the answer. Before that fix, some interactions left little or no trace. Organizations must treat that period as a blind spot in their evidence chain. The timelines revealed that exfil by summary looked like ordinary collaboration, unless you could tie the response back to file reads. Okay, so basically, treat Copilot like a high-speed research assistant whose bibliography is your evidence. The Copilot schema in the Management Activity API links an interaction to content sources, SharePoint sites, OneDrive paths, message threads, and captures the user, the app surface, e.g. Word, Teams, M365, and the interaction time. The simple version is, if Copilot's answer required reading 5 libraries across finance and HR, those reads are auditable and should align with UAL file accessed and file downloaded events. Here's what most people miss. Prompts can be broad and still look benign. Summarize last quarter's vendor disputes across finance and HR invites cross-site traversal. If the same user then exports the summary or copies the output into an external channel, Copilot became a multiplier. The evidence suggests 3 high-risk behaviors: unusually broad prompts that span business units, cross-site summaries followed by concentrated file touches, and export-like actions immediately after an answer appears. To trace the artifacts, sessionize around the interaction. Build a 15-30-minute window keyed on user ID, app ID, and client IP. Within that window, join Copilot interaction events to UAL operations, file accessed, file previewed, and file downloaded. You're looking for a pattern, prompt, surge of reads across multiple sensitive sites, downstream action, export, email forwarding, external share. Upon closer examination, the burst of reads often includes files the user has never accessed before. Novelty is a strong signal. Mitigations rely on scope and friction. Least privileged data access isn't optional. Copilot only sees what the user sees. Harden your information architecture, sensitivity labels that actually gate access, not just watermark. Use conditional access to restrict AI apps from risky sign-in contexts or unmanaged devices. Align DLP with AI outputs. Treat Copilot responses as content that can trigger policies, not just the source files. Alert logic should be compound, not atomic. If a Copilot interaction references more than n distinct sites classified as sensitive within 20 minutes, and the same session shows UAL reads from those sites, raise medium severity. If a Copilot interaction is followed within 10 minutes by sharing link created with scope organization or anyone for any referenced file, escalate to high. If a user with repeated medium risk sign-ins initiates Copilot interactions touching files they've never accessed in 90 days, open a case. The counterintuitive part, Copilot itself isn't the leak, the export is. Monitor the egress channels tied to AI outputs, paste into external chats, downloads of generated documents, email to external domains. The linkage is the proof. Copilot interaction D, referenced files, new artifact created or sent. In other words, the summary was the staging, the send was the theft. Operational practices matter. Tag sensitive repositories clearly so Copilot source references map to risk tiers. Build KQL that aggregates Copilot interaction by user ID and counts distinct site URLs referenced per session. Joins to URL to count unique object ID reads in that session. Flags novelty rate, percentage of files first seen for that user in 180 days. A micro story from a quiet case, 0841, Copilot interaction in Teams, broad prompt spanning finance and HR disputes, 0842, 0846, 420. File accessed across 2 finance libraries and 1 HR site. User had no prior history with 90% of them. 0847, a new Word doc created with extracted bullet points. 0849, sharing link created scope organization on that doc. 0852, email sent externally with the doc attached. No DLP hit on the source files. The generated file slipped past profile-based rules. The interaction log was the hinge. Without it, the narrative looks like unrelated reads and a normal email. In the end, Copilot is an amplifier. With clean logs, it's a transparent amplifier. Without them, it's a silent one. Tie the interaction to the reads and the egress, and the multiplier becomes measurable and stoppable. The case, reconstructing acquired data exfiltration. It started with an ordinary identity, 1 mailbox, 1 workstation, a predictable schedule. The anomaly arrived quietly. 3 medium-risk sign-ins spread over a week. Each require MFA, each successful. No device non-compliance, no malware, just friction. Then passage. The evidence suggests the door opened and stayed ajar. Day 1, 0214 UTC. Entra flags unfamiliar sign-in properties from an ASN the user has never touched. Conditional access requires MFA. Success. Nothing else. Day 3, 0352, different IP range, same city profile, same medium risk. Another successful MFA. Day 6, 0510. A third ASN, still medium risk, still allowed. The pattern matters. Repetition with variation. New networks, same user, consistent, allow. Upon closer examination, that sequence is how an attacker builds confidence that enforcement can be satisfied on demand. The ledger picks up the trail. At 0742 on day 6, the UAL records device sync client registration for OneDrive, file sync added on a machine never seen in the tenant for this user. 6 minutes later, sharing link created across 2 SharePoint sites, finance and HR, scopes widened to organization. Within the next 12 minutes, file downloaded and file accessed spike, 1,100 unique items, parallelized across libraries with access patterns that don't resemble normal search or browsing. Still no DLP trigger. The evidence suggests staging, not collaboration. Here's what most people miss. Privilege adjustments hid in plain sight. At 0758, AdSpoozer adds the user to a site group with edit rights on the finance site. The actor appears to be a delegated admin account with a legitimate service principal history, but the timing doesn't align with any approved change ticket. The counterintuitive part is that the privilege change wasn't maximal, it was just enough to remove friction from sync and link creation. Least change, greatest effect. Email provides an egress contour. At 0803, set inbox rule enables forwarding of all mail with report or statement in the subject to a consumer domain. It's scoped, not global, subtle enough to evade coarse alerts. A low volume trickle begins, but it's not the main channel, it's a contingency. PURVIEW shifts explain the dimming. At 0921, a retention policy scoped to finance reduces coverage. One HR site is excluded temporarily for migration. The additional details field lacks a change ticket ID. 19 minutes later, the finance policy toggles from retain to retain none for temporary cleanup, applied to a subset of libraries. No audit recording change yet, just the survivability of content altered. The timelines revealed the correlation. Policy reduction precedes the heaviest access bursts. Copilot ties the aggregation. At 0949, a Copilot interaction in Teams, a broad prompt. Summarize vendor disputes and payout variances across finance and HR for Q2. From 0949 to 0955, the interaction references 3 sensitive sites. UAL mirrors the surge. File accessed across libraries where the user has minimal history. At 0957, a new Word document appears, extracted bullets and totals. At 10:00, sharing link created scope organization on that doc. At 10:03, an email to an external address carries the attachment. No DLP hit. The generated document didn't match the legacy policy fingerprint. The pivot that exposed data staging wasn't the file count. It was the pairing. New sync relationship plus widened sharing links within the same session window. Every time that duo appears alongside a novelty spike, files the user has never touched, it predicts exfiltration within the hour. In this environment, nothing is accidental. The reconstructed timeline is clinical. Repeated medium-risk sign-ins from diverse ASNs allowed via MFA. New sync client registration followed by organization-scoped sharing links. Targeted forwarding rule creation in exchange, narrow, persistent, secondary egress. PURVIEW retention narrowing on involved sites. Change ticket absent, language temporary. Copilot interaction spanning finance and HR, source references to sensitive libraries, burst of novel reads. Generated document shared internally, then sent externally, no DLP interception. Forensic conclusion. Identity risk set the stage. The UL recorded staging behaviors. PURVIEW edits attempted to weaken evidence durability. Copilot accelerated aggregation. Exchange rules provided continuity. Together, they form a coherent exfiltration pattern. Low noise, policy compliant on paper, detectable only when the artifacts are correlated. The lesson extends to control. The detection that would have interrupted this case requires compound logic. Repeated medium-risk sign-ins within 7 days. New file sync added for the user, sharing link created with widened scope on sensitive sites, novelty rate above threshold, optional Copilot, interaction touching cross-domain content, any retention policy scope change on those sites inside a 2-hour window. Trigger a containment play, force sign-out, revoke refresh tokens, block sync app ID, and lock sharing scope pending review. In the end, the case isn't unusual. It's ordinary movement, identity, privilege, data, egress, masquerading as business. The artifacts are there. The question is whether you correlate them before the silence returns. Operationalizing zero-trust evidence, queries, alerts, dashboards, automation. Evidence without action is archived. To make the stick, enable the surfaces, shape the data, codify the detections, and wire response paths that a human can trust. Enablement comes first. Verify these are on and flowing to a workspace you control. Entra ID protection, risk telemetry, risky sign-ins, risk detections, workload, identity anomalies. PURVIEW audit, unified audit, log with premium events where licensed. Set retention beyond investigation horizons. Copilot interaction logs via the Management Activity API Copilot schema. Exchange mailbox auditing and SharePoint, OneDrive workloads included in audit scope. Stream all of it to a consistent store, Microsoft Sentinel or Log Analytics for KQL. If you rely only on portal views, your 30 and 90-day windows will erase context mid-case. KQL building blocks start with sessionization. The ledger doesn't hand you a session key. Derive one. Compute session key equals hash user ID plus app ID plus client IP plus BN, time generated 30empt. Maintain per session key aggregates, unique files, unique sites, privilege change flag, sharing scope, widened, sync enabled flag, novelty rate. Mass access deltas are not raw counts, they're change from baseline. Build a per user rolling baseline of unique files touched per 30-minute bin and flag any bin P95 for that user and workload. Add a novelty rate, percentage of objects first seen by that user in 180 days. High count with high novelty is staging. High count with low novelty is often normal sync. Detection recipes must reflect the case pattern, not isolated spikes. Recipe 1. Repeated medium risk sign-ins. Staging. Join identity. Info A summarize count EE. D count client IP. Make set. Risk detail. By user ID. BN. Time generated 7D. Risk level. Where risk level equals medium and count. E3 and D count client IP. E3 left join to any conditional access. Outcome MFA required successes. Output user ID when criteria hold. Recipe 2. New sync plus sharing scope widened plus novelty spike. Identify file sync added or device sync. Client registration events per user. Within 60 minutes, check for sharing link. Created where link scope in. Organization anonymous. In same session key. Unique files. User P95 and novelty rate. 7. Raise high severity if site sensitivity is high. Recipe. 3. Forwarding rule plus access burst. Find set inbox rule. New inbox rule where forward to or redirect to external domains within 60 minutes in same session key. SharePoint file downloaded. User P95 elevate if rule uses subject filters to evade volume-based alerts. Recipe 4. PURVIEW policy change proximity. Detect retention policy edits where mode change to do not retain or excluded locations increased correlate to any access spike on affected locations within 2 hours. If additional details lacks change ticket ID, mark as suspicious. Recipe 5. Copilot cross-site interaction plus egress for Copilot interaction. Count distinct site URL referenced in 20 minutes. If distinct sites threshold, and novelty rate high, then check for downstream sharing link created or file expo RT within 10 minutes. Elevate if user has active risky sign-in recipe hit in past 7 days. Turn recipes into alert rules with clear thresholds, suppression, and escalation. Alert thresholds. Repeated medium risk, 3 events, 7 days from 3+ ASNs, suppress for 48 hours after case open. Sync plus scope widen plus novelty. Any occurrence on sensitive sites. No suppression unless tagged change window. Forwarding rule plus burst. Any occurrence. Suppress for known migration tags. PURVIEW. Tamper proximity. Immediate high severity. No suppression without dual approval ticket. Copilot cross-site plus egress. 2+ sensitive sites and downstream share export. Suppress per user for 12 hours post-investigation note. Suppression windows prevent noise during sanctioned work. Tag allowed operations using service principal id allow list for migration tooling. Additional details. Change ticket ID from CAB approved changes. Known admin UPN allow list for break glass with time-bounded exceptions. Escalation paths need human eyes at the right moment. Define tiers. Tier 1. Identity friction patterns. Recipe 1. Route to identity. SecOps. SLA 4 business hours. Tier 2. Data staging. Recipe 2, 3, 5. Route to data protection. SLA 1 hour. Tier. PURVIEW tampering. Recipe 4. Route to incident commander. SLA 15 minutes and auto containment. Dashboards are where patterns become obvious. Build 3 Power BI tilesets sourced from your log analytics tables. Identity risk trend. Per user and per department counts of medium and high risk. D count, client IP, conditional access outcomes. Highlight users crossing the 3 and 7 threshold. Staging hotspots. Map of sites with recent spikes in unique files and novelty rate. Overlaid with sharing scope widened and sync-enabled flag counts. Include a filter for sensitivity labels. Policy change heat map, calendar view of retention and label policy edits with impact score, locations touched, X sensitivity, and correlation markers for adjacent access spikes. Add a ledger view for investigations, timeline strip per session key, showing icons for privilege changes, sync enablement, sharing scope, Copilot interactions, forwarding rules, and export events. The analyst shouldn't reconstruct mentally, let the timeline tell it. Automation tightens the loop. Use Sentinel playbooks, logic apps for containment and notification. For Tier 2 and Tier E, auto-execute, revoke, Azure, AD user, all refresh tokens, invalidate sessions for targeted app IDs, SharePoint, OneDrive. Disable new sync on the user via graph. Set external sharing on impacted sites to existing guests temporarily. Lock down sharing scope by calling SharePoint Admin API to revert link scopes on affected sites. Quarantine generated docs by applying a hold incident sensitivity label via graph and moving to a secured library with a legal hold. Create a ticket in your ITSM with the full artifact set. User ID, session key, queries used, affected sites, policy diff, and a preservation link. Use Power Automate for Analyst Assist. When an alert fires, auto-compile a briefing. Last 7 days of identity risk, last 24 hours of UAL for the user ID, policy changes nearby, and a list of novel files touched. Deliver to a Teams incident channel. If the analyst marks benign migration, write back a tag into a reference list so future alerts suppress during that change window. Governance cements credibility. Assign log ownership. Identity telemetry owner ensures risky sign-ins and detections export weekly beyond native retention. Audit owner validates UAL ingestion completeness and reconciles ingestion gaps daily. Policy owner enforces dual control on retention and maintains the change ticket ID mandate. Evidence custodian manages worm storage and secondary region mirroring for policy edits and alert snapshots. Define retention SLAs aligned to your investigative reality. 180 days minimum for risky sign-ins and detections, 1 year for UAL, 10 years for policy changes and incident evidence bundles. If licensing limits apply, export to your CM and enforce immutability at the storage layer. Finally, preservation procedures. When any Tier 2 or Tier Alert opens, auto-freeze the related artifacts, copy the relevant rows to a locked table, export the policy JSON snapshots, and capture hashes of generated documents. In this environment, nothing is accidental. Your chain of custody shouldn't be either. With evidence operationalized, Zero Trust stops being a promise and becomes a record. The only remaining step is to make the lesson explicit. Zero Trust only works when identities, actions, policy edits, and AI access are correlated into one defensible narrative. Turn that into practice now. Enable the 4 log sources, deploy the detection recipes, and use the starter KQL, Sentinel playbooks, and Power BI dashboards linked here to convert traces into response. Subscribe for the deeper walkthrough and grab the query pack in the next podcast.